Hello, everyone. I'm happy to introduce our speakers, discussants. I don't know how we call them. I'm very much looking forward to this panel. I read the piece today. I was just. Yes, I'm speaking to the microphone. I don't know if it's not helping.
I think that microphone is just for Zoom.
Just speak louder.
Okay, I'll try.
That's better.
Okay. I was saying I'm very excited for this panel. I read the piece, and I was telling Isaac before that I was like playing with the website, listening to the recordings, the testimonies, which was a very, very difficult job. I spent half the afternoon crying. So yeah, this is a shared admiration for the rigorosity of this project and for the ability to work with these difficult materials.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just have John Efron texting me that he can hear no one who's speaking on the Zoom live stream.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do we want to turn on a light in the room?
Just in addition.
Yeah, just so we can see the.
So sorry, excuse me.
So that we can hear.
That's better.
But the audio is off?
The audio
You know,
doesn't
I
hear
could also
anyone talking.
turn on my microphone on the laptop.
Can't see or
and we can
can't
just use
hear?
that instead of
Can't
the-
hear, can't hear.
Can't hear. Okay. So
Yeah,
that
it
might be
should be
fine.
working. I'll just double check with Jennifer, but.
Is his sound on? Because that's often the issue.
Yeah, we need to make sure.
Yeah.
Don't mean
You guys
that's
talking?
question.
I
No,
don't know if
really.
you have a microphone, but
Yes, I'm speaking to the mic. I don't know if is this one. I don't know. It's turned on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Looks like it's going through Zoom, so should be on.
okay.
All right. Okay, so let me simply introduce our speakers. Isaac Bleaman is assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics here and an affiliate of the Center for Jewish Studies, working on sociolinguistic variations and minority language maintenance. He addresses these broad areas by analyzing how individuals and communities speak and write in Yiddish. The writing we will be discussing today is part of a wider project funded by a 5-year career grant from the National Science Foundation, which is very exciting, to develop a corpus of conversational Yiddish from video-recorded Holocaust survivor testimonies. And our second speaker is Chaya Nove, who's a postdoctoral scholar in the linguistics department here, working on as part of this project on the Corpus of Spoken Yiddish in Europe. She holds a Ph.D. in linguistics from the Graduate Center at CUNY, New York, and has received funding from the Association for Jewish Studies and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. And aside from her work on this project, on the Corpus for Spoken Yiddish in Europe, is that? Yeah. Her research centers on variation and change in New York Hasidic Yiddish, which is also her native language. Nove's current project investigates regional variation in Central Yiddish vowels using data from the CSYE project. So I'm happy to.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear. Thank you, Roni, for that introduction. So today, Chaya and I are going to be discussing a new Yiddish language corpus. This is a jointly authored talk based on a jointly authored manuscript that hopefully many of you have read. If you did read the manuscript, we're very grateful to get any feedback that you have, but otherwise we will be summarizing kind of the main points of that paper, and so everybody will be up to speed by the end of this talk. By way of introduction, if I can navigate the slides. There we go. This goes without saying at a forum like this, with this audience, but in addition to being a genocide of an unprecedented scale, the Holocaust can also be described as an act of linguicide. Of the 6 million Jews who were murdered, it's been estimated that over 80% of them were Yiddish speakers. The destruction of Yiddish-speaking communities over such a vast territory had a permanent impact on the language, contributing to the endangerment of most of its European dialects, and driving the displacement of its surviving speakers in the second half of the 20th century which shaped the language further through new contexts of language contact and dialect mixing. If you want to get a glimpse into Yiddish as a language of everyday spontaneous conversation before the Holocaust, perhaps the best evidence we have comes from testimony interviews with survivors. These materials are crucial for research on the language itself, but also a critical resource for language learners who wish to engage with the voices of native speakers, acquire proficiency in their own heritage dialects spoken by their families, and various other applications. To our knowledge, the largest collection of survivor testimonies in Yiddish, and also by extension of conversational interviews in Yiddish more generally, is the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. The archive is truly enormous, amounting to over 12 years of video if played back to back. Now, speakers were given the choice of language to use in their interview, and most opted to speak not in their native languages, but in the majority language of their country of resettlement. So the majority of interviews are in English, but there are also many interviews in Hebrew and Russian. Yiddish interviews make up only a small fraction, less than 2% of the VHA, but this amounts to almost 700 multi-hour video recordings. These interviews are a rich source of information on all aspects of European Yiddish, including its regional and social dialects, grammatical structures, registers and styles, intonation patterns, co-speech gestures like what I'm doing now, and numerous other topics. Unfortunately, there are currently very high barriers to accessing these materials. Only a handful of the interviews can be viewed by the public through the VHA online. Most of them live behind a subscription wall and can only be streamed in the browser while visiting access sites, which are typically university libraries that pay for a subscription. Unfortunately, that means that almost none of the institutions that host intensive Yiddish language courses, including YIVO, the Yiddish Book Center, the Medem Bibliothek in Paris, the Workers' Circle, which conducts its courses mostly online, can provide their students or instructors with access to these materials. The language data in the materials is also locked up in video format. Relatively few of these videos contain any topic indexing for keywords that can be searched in the VHA, including geographical locations, and none of them are available in the VHA with transcripts. Also, as I alluded to before, it's prohibited to download these materials, which means it's difficult to transcribe them, and it's also impossible to use them with most of the software that is necessary for linguistic research. So today we'll describe our work to create a linguistic corpus, basically a digital language archive, that will be accessible to the public online for free, and actually is already partially, some of the materials are already accessible online. The project was funded at first by faculty fellowships here at UC Berkeley, and more recently by a 5-year career grant from the NSF. We've secured an unprecedented license from the USC Shoah Foundation covering the use of several hundred Yiddish testimonies. This agreement allows us to create and publish orthographic transcripts. It also permits us to share the audio files with the researchers, students, and the general public to download. The video files will be available to view on the Corpus website with our transcripts embedded as subtitles. Much of the funding is being used for interview transcription. Transcription is extremely time and labor intensive, and it requires rather specialized language skills because of the sheer number of different Yiddish dialects that are heard in the recordings, as well as code switching with many different languages in these interviews. And so our goal is to create transcripts that are as accurate as possible and reflect all of the nuances of the survivor's Yiddish. As a first step, we use software to carry out a process of speaker diarization. That's a term I'll explain in just a moment. We then transcribe the interviews and review the transcripts. And then finally, the transcripts are converted to the Yiddish alphabet and published online in a variety of text formats. We're currently also looking into the best process for doing forced alignment. That's another technical term that I'll explain in a few slides. Okay, you may be wondering, why do we need a new conversational corpus for Yiddish? How does this corpus compare to existing archival resources on spoken Yiddish? We don't have time to draw comparisons to all of the major resources. There are a number of them. But a very famous one that we feel is quite complementary to our new corpus is the Language and Culture Archive of Ashkenazic Jewry at Columbia that was created for the production of the Sprach Atlas, the Atlas of Yiddish dialects. And I'll call this the LCAAJ, as it's known. Unlike the LCAAJ interviews, which were based on a survey with thousands of questions related to Yiddish dialects and cultural items, these interviews, these testimony interviews, feature spontaneous conversational speech primarily. So while the LCAAJ can tell us whether or not a particular language feature is attested in a particular region of Europe, Conversational data like this can tell us how often a feature is used. Also, because the speakers tell us their whole life stories, we can look for interesting correlations that exist between the frequency of language features and the social factors that were important for the internal differentiation of Jewish society in pre-Holocaust Europe. That's what we're interested in as sociolinguists. Also, while the LCA-AJ recordings were made mostly in the 1960s on noisy reel-to-reel tapes and then digitized, these interviews were conducted between 1995 and 2001. They were videotaped, and their quality lends itself much better to phonetic analysis, and also they're simpler, easier to understand when you listen to them. And finally, none of the LCA-AJ interviews are available with full transcripts. As far as I know, that's not something that's on the horizon for the Columbia libraries, and of course, that's one of our primary outputs. Okay, I want to share a bit more detail about what we're doing to put this corpus together. Because automatic transcription technology does not yet exist in Yiddish, and because interview data is quite complicated, there's lots of overlapping speech, people have false starts when they speak, dialect mixing and language mixing that I mentioned already, we decided to hire Yiddish-speaking expert transcribers to do much of this work by hand. One step that we have been able to automate is speaker diarization. It's a fancy term used in speech technology research that refers to the task of identifying the time moments in an interview when people are talking as opposed to not talking or silence, and then determining which speaker is talking in those moments and assigning that interval to the correct tier. In this case, we have two tiers, the survivor and the interviewer. There are two people speaking. We use machine learning techniques for this, and the resulting output can be opened in transcription program like Elan, which is pictured here on the slide. And then these speech segments are manually transcribed. By the way, if this is something that you're interested in doing, if you or your students have recordings that you need to transcribe with timestamps like this, we've published a tutorial online, including some interactive code that you can execute in your browser. You just provide audio recordings, tell it how many speakers you have, and it'll do this for you. Okay, these diarized recordings are then transcribed by a small team of Yiddish speakers who are trained on our transcription conventions. We do transcription using YIVO-like transliteration, in large part because, as I mentioned already, survivors often mix languages, and having both right to left and left to right text on the same screen can be pretty tricky to work with. These transcripts are then assigned to reviewers who are responsible for catching typos, mishearings, and hopefully most of the words that the transcribers had marked as being unknown or unclear. And then the final step is that, so far I've been doing this, but taking these transcripts and respelling them orthographically in the Yiddish alphabet so that we can share these materials with the public in both formats. I do this mostly in an automated way. I use a Python package that I put together called Yiddish. That name wasn't already taken. You just do pip install Yiddish, import Yiddish, and then you run a function there called detransliterate on each speech segment. And then I proofread the output just to make sure it's good. I had a comment here that you might be able to see on the screenshot, but probably not because it's very, very small. But there are a number of words in the Yiddish that are from Lashon Kodesh, they're from Hebrew, and so they're not spelled phonemically like other elements of Yiddish are, Germanic, Slavic. But they are correctly spelled in this transcript, and that's because if you give it the argument Lashon Kodesh is true, it will look up every word in a list of phonemic respellings that was provided to me by Eliezer Naborsky, whose father, Yitzchak Naborsky, put together a dictionary of these items. And then I expanded this list to include inflectional forms. So it does a pretty good job handling those exceptional things as well. Just see in the chat. Is the video not working? Oh, okay. So these Elan files, Elan again is the name of the program that we use for transcriptions. These Elan files are the basis for the transcripts that we then publish online to a GitHub repository. The available formats include a simple tab-separated text file, so we have the name of the speaker and then timestamps when each utterance occurs, and then the content of the utterance. And we also have formats that are of more use to linguists. And then finally, we have subtitle files. These are automatically embedded into the video player that we show on the website. Before showing you the website, I want to share one other format that we're in the process of creating now. As you saw before, the transcripts that we create have time segments, right? But those are time segments that tell you when each utterance or phrase occurs, surrounded by silences. But in linguistic research, we often want to have finer grained alignments. We want to know specifically the time segments where each word occurs, and also when each phoneme or speech sound occurs in each word. So we're able to do this using the Montreal Force Aligner. This uses a pronunciation dictionary, basically a list that maps words to sounds. And again, machine learning to figure out where each of these words and sounds occurs in the recordings that we've marked off. This screenshot shows a spectrogram from part of a sentence, Shabbos is gewein Shabbos. And what you can see is this is just the word Shabbos, where that word occurs as found by the MFA, and then where each of the phonemes occurs. You can see the sh, the vowels and the consonants there are being marked off with timestamps. Now, why is this useful? Well, a systematic analysis of vowels would typically involve taking measurements of vowel formants. These are concentrations of resonance in the vocal tract that can be observed in the shaded part of the spectrogram, the darker parts, and measured in hertz. And this is acoustic information that can tell us, for example, whether a Ukrainian Yiddish speaker is pronouncing a vowel that's more a-like, Shabbos, or something more o-like, Shobis, which is a feature of that dialect. Or in Litvish Yiddish, we could calculate the center of gravity of the high-pitched frication inside the sh. You can see higher frequencies there, to determine whether speakers are pronouncing that sound more sh-like Shabbos or more sa-like Sabbos, or maybe some third category. So we can automate that kind of analysis once we have these finer-grained alignments. Okay, so here's a website. It's live now if you want to check it out after the talk by visiting yiddishcorpus.org, with the caveat that we don't yet have many review tapes that we put online yet. We have a kind of a big backlog to go through for review. But this is the website. One of the more interesting views into the data, into these materials, is through the map tab, which I will click on now in the screenshot. Here is the base map. It shows where speakers were born on the current map, so with current political boundaries. The blue lines you see superimposed on the map are the major dialect boundaries as approximated by David Katz in one of his articles. So you can just see where, if you're interested in particular dialects, this is a good way to look at that. Clicking on the layers in the top right of the map provides additional information. First, if you're interested in a particular region and you want to hear additional recordings beyond what we have in the corpus, these points show speakers who are in the LCAAJ, the LCAAJ informants, whose recordings have recently been redigitized and put on the Columbia Library website. And so there are links that you can click on to get those speakers. We also have made available certain historical map layers. Here's one showing the political boundaries from 1914. Adding historical map layers like this was an idea that I had after getting feedback from one of our reviewers, who said it's a little bit strange to hear a survivor say, I was born in Vilna, Vilna, Russia, but the map shows that the city is currently in a totally different country. It's in Lithuania. So we can embed these kinds of historical map layers. They're originally actually paper maps that have been geo-rectified so they can be superimposed on a digital map as they become available. Hopefully we'll get access to more of these. And so we also have one historical map that's in Yiddish here from 1922, but it's not as fine-grained as this 1914 one. Okay, each testimony in the corpus has its own page like this with metadata on top, so name, gender, age, when they were born, when they're interviewed. This particular speaker, Yosef Katz, so yeah, every survivor gets a page like this. Yosef Katz was born in Satmar, so he's a particularly good informant for the historical development of today's Hasidic Yiddish. If we scroll down a little bit, you can see, again, some more maps. This is where the speaker was born and where the speaker was interviewed. In many, many cases, the vast majority of cases, this is quite a long distance between these 2 points. So he was born in Satmar, as I said, and then interviewed in Miami Beach. At the bottom here, you can see all of the tapes of the testimony that have been transcribed so far. A tape here, by the way, refers to corresponds to a VHS cassette that was at most 30 minutes in length and subsequently digitized by the VHA. So our transcripts are embedded in the video. You can see here as subtitles. This is in the Hebrew-based Yiddish alphabet and also in transliteration, which is the initial transcription scheme that we have, convention. Scrolling down further, you can see the transcript that's embedded as a table, again, in both orthographies, the Yiddish alphabet and the Latin alphabet. And you can also do some search filtering at the top if you type in particular search strings. Each line of the transcript here is actually a hyperlink. So if you click on it, it'll scroll to the correct tape and to the correct timestamp, and you can hear the person say that line. Okay, and finally, scrolling down to the very bottom of the page for each testimony, we have links where you can download the audio file for the transcribed tapes, along with a link to the text version of the transcript, and also a link to our full GitHub repository if you want other formats that would be used in linguistics, like text grids. At the very bottom, we have information about how to cite this source in your research and your teaching materials. We ask that users cite the corpus as well as the survivor. So This is an important principle of the USC Shoah Foundation, but the survivors are the authors of their testimony, and so we request that you cite them by name, and we make that easy by giving you the information. You can just copy paste into your papers. Okay, with that, I'll turn things over to Chaya.
Okay, thank you. I know all this and still I'm impressed. I'm listening, I'm like, wow. Look what Isaac did. Yeah, so we're sociolinguists, and so when we're talking about, I'll be talking about use cases and give you some examples. So when we think about the possible applications of the corpus, we focus primarily on use cases in our field. So for example, we think about ways that the corpus can be used. We think about to research known Yiddish dialects and discover previously undiscovered features or regional nuances within these larger dialect areas, to establish a baseline for contemporary varieties of Yiddish, for example, the Yiddish of Hasidic communities, which I research, and to assess claims about innovation and change in these dialects, to better understand the effects of language and dialect contact on post-immigration Yiddish, and to conduct research on Yiddish among the elderly. And I'll share a bit more about the first two uses with some examples. So while Yiddish has had the advantage of an early start in the context of minority language studies, some dialects of Yiddish are better described than others, and some areas, especially those that were culturally or geographically marginal, are overlooked completely due to convenience or bias. Yiddish is also among the very few Germanic languages that have not been acoustically analyzed, which is a shame given that the dialect classification is based mostly on phonological features, which can be done with so much more precision if you have acoustic analyses. So the first study to come out of the CSYE project is an acoustic analysis that I conducted with my colleague Ben Sadek, who's also a transcriber on our project, in which we examined the status of an historical length contrast in Central or Mid-Eastern Yiddish. I'll call it CY. So this feature allows for such minimal pairs as Zin, the sun, the star, and Zin, son, male offspring, and Hand, Hand, like hand, and Hand, which is today. The vocalic length contrast was inherited from Middle High German, and it was subsequently lost in all Yiddish dialects except for CY. So now the Central Yiddish dialect region is a really large area. It spans over 400 miles north to south, and from central Poland to Romania, and it includes historical Galicia or Galicia, eastern Slovakia, and northeastern Hungary. Although it's known colloquially as Polish Yiddish, only about a third of the CY territory is actually on Polish lands. The southern portion of the CY dialect region is the area that was formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which presently includes parts of Slovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, and most of Romania. Within the southern portion, the eastern half is the part that was known among Yiddish-speaking as the Interland, to distinguish it from the western Oberland, which was quite distinct both culturally and linguistically. So, when thinking about Jewish language and culture within the CY territory, there are at least these three broad subregions that we want to consider. So Weinreich, 1964, took a first stab at describing the Oberland-Interland difference, and the study that I'm reviewing here is a comparison of central Poland in the north and the Interland in the south. So I want to list first some socio-historical facts about these two Jewish communities, the North and South, that emphasize the differences that could affect language use. So the first documented evidence of a Jewish presence in the Warsaw area is from 1414. By the 18th century, Warsaw's Jewish population had grown dramatically, and it ultimately became one of the main centers of Jewish cultural development. The majority of Jews were Orthodox, and there was a significant Hasidic presence. In the modern period, there was a trend towards urbanization, and Central Polish Jews spanned the entire socioeconomic spectrum. On the eve of World War II, Warsaw Jews numbered approximately 350,000 and constituted about 30% of the total population in Warsaw, the largest Jewish community in Europe and the second largest in the world. Yiddish use was robust, and Polish Jews also, of course, spoke Polish, but oftentimes also other languages spoken in the region. I'm trying to, hang on. Okay, just a second. I can't scroll down on the notes. I'm just trying to. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. In contrast, mass Jewish migration to the Interland began only in the 19th century, so much more recently. They came primarily from Galicia, but also from other Yiddish dialect regions in the east and the west, and then they became somewhat insulated from these regions due to the Carpathian Mountains which surrounded them. Hasidism was even more widespread here than it was in Poland. Urbanization was certainly a trend here as it was elsewhere, but in the 20th century, many Interland Jews still farmed in the valleys of the Carpathian Mountains, and the poverty rate was extremely high. Although the population grew rapidly, it was still very low in comparison to the Polish urban centers. The political borders were constantly in flux. Survivors in the corpus talk about the changes that came along with these shifts in the political power, including changes to their personal names, the names of their cities, the languages of instruction in the schools, and so on. Relatedly, Interland Jews were in contact with different co-territorial languages than Polish Jews, some of which are listed on the slide. Crucially, there was also more linguistic assimilation here than in the north, mostly to Hungarian. And this tendency was especially strong among women who generally attended public school and, unlike the males, didn't receive a formal religious education in Yiddish. Based on these circumstances, we view Polish Yiddish as the older, more conservative dialect, and we consider it likely that in the century leading up to World War II, Interland Yiddish diverged from Polish Yiddish and developed independently. Okay, so with that, hang on. I'll talk about our hypotheses regarding the length contrast. So in my earlier research, I found that in Interland Yiddish, the duration differences between the long-short vowels were surprisingly small for a length distinguishing language. On average, they were less than 50 milliseconds, which linguists have proposed as some kind of a threshold for perceiving difference in vowels. Furthermore, the Interland females in that study had significantly smaller long-short ratios, for E and A in particular, for those pairs, than the male talkers, suggesting that these smaller differences were innovative. And this suggestion is based on trends reported in sociolinguistic research, where females tend to be at the forefront of research, of change. In a pilot study that Ben and I conducted, we found significant duration difference between male talkers in central Poland and male talkers in the Interland. And so, based on these findings, we hypothesized that pre-war Interland Yiddish was undergoing change and was possibly headed towards a long-short vowel merger. So I'll talk about the data and methods of the study next, utilizing the map view on the CSYE website, which, as Isaac demonstrated, displays testimonies by survivors' birthplaces and delineates the main dialect regions. We selected 38 testimonies by men and women from the CY region, 21 from the Interland, and 17 from central Poland. The audio of the first two tapes was downloaded from the testimony page of each speaker, which you saw before, and the corresponding prot files, which is a text grid format, were retrieved from the CSYE transcripts GitHub repository. Next, the transcripts were tokenized, meaning they were broken into lists of unique words. They were broken into lists of words, and the unique words were added to a pronunciation dictionary where the pronunciation of each word was manually mapped according to the way that the word would be pronounced in Central Yiddish. The completed dictionary was then used to align the transcripts to the audio, as Isaac demonstrated, which is some of the next steps that we'll be doing to all of the testimonies using the Montreal Forced Aligner. With the time-aligned audio and text grids, we were then able to extract all the stressed vowels and measure their durations using a prot plugin called FastTrack. In total, approximately 50,000 vowel tokens were analyzed and compared for this study. So let's look at some results. Looking at the mean duration of the 6 target vowels on this bar chart by region, we can immediately see that the Polish talkers have larger durational differences in all the vowel pairs. And the differences are printed above the short vowel bars. As in the pilot study, the differences in the Interland all fall slightly below the 50 milliseconds threshold, while the differences in Central Poland meet or exceed that threshold.
Sorry, should we turn on the camera on the laptop? Is there a camera problem?
No, there's the sound problem. Sorry to.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's not a
Do it.
problem with the recording.
Yeah.
It's a problem for our 6 Zoom attendees.
We can turn the audio on the microphone on and the camera on the computer.
I think it's a finicky cable, so it's going in and out.
Oh boy.
The recording will be fine. The Zoom attendees are not.
Sorry.
Well, maybe we can still fix it, is what I'm saying.
It should be fixed. Like, it is the cable, but I believe it should be good for the rest of the thing. It's not doing it now. I can let you know if it does
Okay.
again, and we can switch it.
Sorry.
The recording, as I said, the recording that everybody else is enjoying in this room will be preserved, and we'll be able to share it with all of the Zoom
Okay,
attendees.
yeah, I guess so.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, so next we can look at the results after the data were modeled statistically using linear regression to control for effects like particular consonants, words, differences between individual speakers, and other factors that might influence vowel duration. And these plots show lines connecting the durations of the long and the short vowel in each of the 3 pairs, I, U, and A in Polish and Interland Yiddish, separately for men and women, and the red line is for the females. Women apparently have longer vowels overall than men. That's why they're like showing above. But that's probably because a number of the women in our data set just spoke slower than the men, for whatever reason. The model also tells us that the Interland Yiddish had a significantly smaller length contrast than Polish Yiddish, which can be seen in the relatively flatter line in the Interland plots. It's more visible in some of them because of the scale, but the model says that they're all statistically significant. The results of this study suggest that the vocalic length contrast, which dates back to the earliest stages of the language from Middle High German and was maintained in Poland for centuries, was undergoing some change and may have been on the verge of collapse in 20th century Interland. In the paper, we suggest that the geopolitical and the sociocultural circumstances that I mentioned previously created these optimal conditions for language change. The second important use case that I mentioned for us as sociolinguists is the potential for the corpus to help establish some baseline for comparison when evaluating language change in contemporary Yiddish. When linguists encounter previously undescribed features in contemporary dialects, they often chalk it up to innovation. Oh, this is new. For example, Kahn Newman discusses a discourse particle schoin that she assumes has an innovative function. Bleaman discusses a change in word order. Belk, who is that? Belk et al. Talk about the loss of case and gender marking. Of course, we can only say that the language has changed if we have something to which to compare it. Sometimes people consult published grammars or written texts or even the LCAAJ, but the findings can be inconsistent. Ultimately, they may not actually be comparable to the contemporary data collected in those projects. As an example, Issac, Bleaman, analyzes the placement of the word tsu in particle verbs on a Hasidic Yiddish discussion forum where we see forms like auszurechnen with tsu in the standard place, but also tsu ausrechnen with the tsu in the front. In that paper, he speculates that the latter form is an innovation, in part because it's not seen in many published European texts from before the war, and in part because speakers of Interland Yiddish in the LCAAJ didn't accept that structure. But the LCAAJ only included one question on this. Also, how people say that they speak doesn't always correspond with how they actually speak. So people may say, no, that's not correct, and a few minutes later, they may use that exact form. So we don't really know how widespread or frequent it could be in spoken Yiddish. So here's one illustrative finding that compares Yiddish from the CSYE testimonies with contemporary speakers. This is discussed in Issac's dissertation, but it's also under review as a standalone study. So Bleaman analyzes the duration of the release burst in the consonants PTK at the beginnings of words. So in English, these sounds are pronounced with aspiration or a puff of air, as in table. It has that little burst of air. But in Yiddish, aspiration is supposed to be disallowed. So it'll be like tish. Measuring the duration of that burst in interviews that he conducted with 40 native Yiddish speakers, speaking New Yorkers, Bleaman found that Yiddishists, or people who attend Yiddishvach, or non-Hasidic speakers, had longer bursts than Hasidim. But is this a case of divergence that took place in New York Yiddish, or is it possible that the difference was inherited from the community's different input dialects? So statistical modeling here finds no differences among the European dialects, and so this is based on 10 speakers from the CSYE. On the other hand, both New York communities actually diverge from the European baseline, but the magnitude of the difference is smaller among the Hasidim than among the Yiddishists. So these two case studies that I've just shown illustrate how the recordings available through CSYE can be used to evaluate these previous claims about Yiddish dialects and to reconstruct an historical baseline against which ongoing language change can be documented and analyzed. Other questions that linguists, including ourselves, might want to pursue in the future are related to the role that the Holocaust has played in the language, in language change in Yiddish, especially when surviving speakers, as we've seen, were displaced to locations where they encountered new languages, and they came in contact with speakers of Yiddish dialects that were different from their own. So beyond linguistics, we also envision that the CSYE can be enormously useful for language teaching. While Yiddish has certainly endured as an everyday language in communities around the world, most of the pre-war dialects are now endangered or gone. In Yiddish classrooms around the world, the language is often acquired without any native speaker input. The CSYE can be used to bring native Yiddish speakers' voices into the classroom. As an open resource, instructors can use the CSYE materials in their Yiddish language courses in a number of ways. For example, in his capacity as a Yiddish language instructor, Issac used short excerpts from the testimonies to illustrate phonological differences across the Yiddish dialects. Other possible pedagogical uses include creating lesson plans and exercises to build thematic vocabulary, using portions of the testimonies as prompts for in-class discussions or for short writing assignments. Students can also be asked to translate short excerpts from the corpus to English or to other languages. And students who are interested in acquiring fluency or revitalizing their family dialects can also look at the recordings from those regions that they know are their ancestral towns, using the map view, and then to listen to those. So we believe that there are limitless usage possibilities for the CSYE in the language classroom, and we're very eager to find ways to collaborate with instructors and with activists to compile these classroom resources and to make them available publicly. The CSYE will contribute to the current landscape of online corpora and sociolinguistics, including the Buckeye corpus, the corpus of regional African American language, and the heritage language documentation corpus by providing media files, transcriptions, and other metadata in accessible formats. One important difference is that the Yiddish interviews were conducted not by linguists, but instead by local community members or amateur historians who hope to document the Holocaust through the eyes of these survivors. In spite of this, the testimonies are very similar in genre to sociolinguistic interviews. So they include prompts that elicit these lengthy narratives, and also on a wide range of topics, and also including memories from childhood, games, recollections of the war, and so on. And the emotionally fraught nature of the content, including discussions of danger of death and unfairness, injustice, violation of social norms, which oftentimes make a person really forget that they're being recorded and just get into the moment. That may mitigate the self-consciousness about being recorded. So these factors contribute to more natural and less performative Yiddish than one would typically encounter in a, for example, a formal dialect interview. So, to conclude, just last week we observed Yom HaShoah, a day that has been set aside to remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust. Along with a loss of life, we also mourn a loss of a way of life. So Jewish communities that had existed for centuries in Europe were decimated. The Nazis, as we know, they burned books, they destroyed cultural institutions, and as a result, much of our cultural heritage and the distinct Yiddish dialects that existed before the Holocaust were lost forever. Almost 80 years after the war, the last survivors are now leaving us. Fortunately, many of their stories have been recorded, and in this way, many of the distinct dialects that were spoken in European towns and villages can still be heard. We're hopeful that the CSYE will allow more people to engage with these Yiddish language materials, and that the voices of the survivors and the sounds of Yiddish can continue to be heard. Shkoyach.
We can field our own questions, probably. That's all right.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, we should stop sharing. Nice.
Questions?
Couple hands there.
Label?
I'm guessing that Hand with the long vowel came from Hein originally?
Yes.
So did it create a long short vowel distinction, or did it fall in with one that was already inherited from German?
It created a new one. And the hypothesis made by Neil Jacobs is that this was some way to achieve symmetry. So there were these long-short vowel contrasts in E and U, and then because the long-short A from German didn't exist because the long A was raised to O and then to U in this dialect. And so only the short A was left in that position as A, and so the monophthongization, the flattening out of that I into an A restored symmetry. That's the structural analysis. But yeah.
So the EU, the long-short distinction in EU was already inherited.
Well, so the only one that's really inherited from Middle High German is E, and that is because both the long-short U and the long-short U merged with E. And so that's why we have a git for gut, gesinnt for gesund, and so on. And so that contains actually like four distinct. So that the short U's went to short E, and the long U's went to long E, and it merged with the E's in those two positions. Then U is a whole interesting, I mean, we call it a length contrast, but I'm starting, based on the research that I'm doing now, I'm starting to question what it really is. So it's one vowel that was split depending on which consonant followed it. And so in certain positions, so for example, in Zug, it became short, but in, what other? I'm blanking on, so anything that is followed by a coronal consonant, or so like a r, a l, tsul. Tsul is like a really long one, like to pay, right? Okay, so yeah, that's the long, sorry. I get very into.
I think the Zoom room was closed.
The Zoom room is been
Abruptly,
closed,
okay.
and we're sorry for the problems, and we're going to improve our system in the future.
Okay, but you guys are all
The next
here.
pandemic.
No.
Well, I
So
can
we can-
kind of casually monitor it if it's reopened.
Yeah, and I don't know if there were any questions put in the chat or not. Jennifer?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is super fascinating. Thank you both so much, and the work's amazing. As a total outsider to linguistics, so I was just wondering, like, I presume there's sociolinguistics work about certain kinds of impacts of trauma on language. I presume there's sociolinguistic work about what happens when people are outside of large communities of speakers, right? So these seem like two really big things that would be interesting to trace in terms of impact of the Shoah, and I'm just wondering whether or not like you're able to trace those kinds of factors in the interviews or the linguistic patterns that you're observing.
Do you want to address that?
So there's the impact of catastrophic events. I think that's the formal term. And we have a colleague, Katie Carmichael, who works on post-Katrina language in New Orleans, which I think is a really nice kind of, I mean, it's not, of course, the magnitude of that, but that's the idea, is that people were displaced. Some of them returned, some of them never returned. And so looking at that is like so there isn't that much research. And I think part of the difficulty is teasing out it's hard to know what to measure. There's so many factors. Yep. So it's a really tough project, but I am very, very interested in both of those things. So I think displacement, like diaspora languages, is a more, you have anything to say about
that? As part of this
yeah.
grant, I proposed doing a project with testimonies from the Warsaw area, not because there's anything special about Warsaw per se, but it was a major city where a lot of Jews lived, and so there are a number of survivors who will be in the corpus who are from Warsaw, and they were displaced to different countries. So we can compare, the grammatical and phonetic properties of people from Warsaw who then resettled in Israel, where the language is very different than the majority languages in the US and in Argentina. And so there are certain grammatical properties that we would expect might have changed because they're more or less similar to those majority languages, the ambient languages. So we can maybe trace those types of changes. And these are people who have been living in these countries in many cases for, a half a century. Yeah, so those are the types of things we can track. As far as attrition, that's not something that I'm super well versed in, but there are attrition effects in the very elderly.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hear it in the recordings in many cases, but that's presumably something that could also be analyzed.
Yeah. So I just to like follow up on that, I think there are these two broad. Like one is after displacement. One is contact with a new language, and so it's language contact. But it's also loss of contact with a homeland, and so if you're not in a community of speakers, even if you never learn the new language, but you're not talking to a Yiddish-speaking community on a daily basis, or you're speaking with Yiddish speakers who speak different dialects, like what happens, right? And we see that all over the corpus. Like people switch dialects, they do these really interesting things.
The interviewers also have interesting Yiddish in many cases. These are usually heritage speakers who sometimes weren't formally educated in Yiddish, and some interesting miscommunications, interesting formulations that they have, and we're transcribing everything, so we have access to that.
Thank you both for this fascinating work. It's really, really cool. So you mentioned that something like over 98% of the survivors who give testimony for the Shoah Foundation project chose to give testimony in the language of their sort of adopted home. And I think in your paper you suggest that this might be because they, reasonably wanted their testimony to be available to their children and grandchildren and so on. I wonder if you have a sense of the factors at play among the speakers who chose to speak in Yiddish. Why did they choose Yiddish? Is it because they are more comfortable in Yiddish, or is it because they want to pass on Yiddish, or other factors?
Yes, it is mysterious, and I would say in most cases it's mysterious because we don't really know the planning that went into the interview process itself. But we do have some cases where the speakers specifically comment on it, and there's one woman, she might be on the homepage of our corpus.
Yes,
there's a picture of her. She says, I checked and her husband's not in the corpus. She says, I decided in solidarity with my husband, who will be giving his testimony in Yiddish, to also give my testimony in Yiddish in memory of the Kedoshim who were murdered during the war, who lived their lives in this language. I would say in most cases, though, it seems to be kind of an unmarked choice.
But we had a hunch. I think we had a hunch that they were doing that for that reason, and then we encountered that testimony, and then there was at least one more that I listened to, who mentioned that explicitly. He said, I think it was this Dov Levanoni or Dov Weiss. And he's recorded in Israel, and I think he also says that. And so I think if two speakers of the small sample that we've listened to so far say it, that we can assume that it's a thing that is on people's minds, that they want to use it as a way to commemorate.
Another question that's probably more applicable for historians is, what do these interviews have that the other ones don't have? In a sense, obviously they have the language, but anything else? And one thing they definitely have probably more of, not that we have many examples I haven't seen many examples of this, but people sometimes will sing songs in Yiddish in their testimonies. Maybe the things they choose to focus on will be slightly different because it's in the language of that society. But I think these are open questions that, hopefully there's so many questions I think a lot of researchers can approach this, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make it available online there's more things than we could possibly analyze.
Yeah, and I have a great aunt who was interviewed, and I spoke to her recently before she died, and she gave her testimony in English, and she said it was actually difficult for her to know what to say. She wasn't sure about the interviewer's background knowledge of Yiddishkeit, of Jewish things, and then when I listened to her testimony, the names that she gives for siblings are not the names that they used in the family. So she Englishized, Americanized. And so just my knowing her and I actually interviewed her myself and recorded her a little bit, it was very, very different, and it sounded less natural to me. And so that's just one example that I have.
Which one sounded less natural?
The English one, I mean, she uses terms. She was really confused about who this interviewer was and what they knew and what she can say. Like, can I say Shabbos? Can I say, like basic stuff, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the wonderful talk. It's been really exciting to see this project develop and to get a work in Isaac's class actually with some of the same data. So I'm curious about, so for in terms of I guess language change and also sort of interaction with different languages. So do I understand correctly that it's only the Yiddish of the interview that would have been pulled out, or is there also sort of a way to see, maybe even track certain kinds of linguistic things in sort of different languages in a multilingual interview? So that's one question. And then the second one, it seems as if, and I myself, I think in that project we ended up looking at gender, and if I understood correctly, it ultimately became sort of a social sort of difference between the Hinterland and Polish Yiddish. But I was kind of curious, is there ways that the database tries to sort of look into, let's say, differentiation, let's say, of social class within a particular region? So for example, is that work being done by the topicalization to sort of, maybe, so basically what, other than something like gender, what's there for the sociolinguist to sort of have an immediate entry, or is this also going to be, possible depending on sort of their research? And I'm just kind of curious what categories other than gender sort of ended up being most useful in the projects you're currently working on, or future papers, and just kind of patterns that you've seen. What other social categories seem important? It seemed like the rural.
Good questions.
Yeah, so I think, what was the first one is?
Other languages.
Other languages,
oh, yes.
Yeah.
So because there's so much raw material to work with, we can't do it all. We are focused on the Yiddish, in scare quotes. What that means is sometimes there are entire tapes that are in different languages. This often happens, I would say, when in the last tape, there's a convention in these interviews at the beginning, the survivor introduces themselves, they spell their name usually aloud, and then in the last tape they either show photographs from the family and they narrate them. Often that's in Yiddish. Sometimes they will bring in their children and grandchildren and just introduce them. That's kind of one of the formulas of making these testimonies in the BHA. And often in those tapes they just switch to a different language. So for now we're not transcribing that. That being said, when people do mixed languages, we try to transcribe things as accurately as possible. So there's sort of like a matrix Yiddish paragraph, so to speak, and they're mixing in English or German or Hungarian, and our transcribers know those languages, or Hebrew. We transcribe those differently.
So
we use all capital letters. That's all done by hand, yeah.
Yeah, and we do put them in all caps so that it's possible to pull those out. So when I'm doing analysis, vowel analysis, I don't want to analyze those words. And so I exclude them from the analysis. And so we're specifically doing that in a way to be able to. Regarding your second question, I mean, you can answer too, but I just want to say that that's kind of what excites me the most is, in my research on contemporary dialects, I really try to look what else beyond those traditional categories that people automatically turn to, because it turns out, for example, that socioeconomic class is not so important for Hasidim. Like people don't have that sense of, and so there's other things though. And so in my research, I looked at something that I called Hasidic orientation, like how inward or outward facing people were culturally, and that turned out to be an interesting predictor for some change. Right now, what I'm thinking about, and so it's hard, so you need enough data to be able to then pull it apart and to have enough, right, to have enough data points for each of these cells. And so one of the things I'm looking at is mobility, and I want to look at mobility. Is it the case that people in the Interland who were moving around more, like to the big cities, like they were in Satmar and then they were in Budapest, are these the ones that are more innovative? So that might be, so it does seem to be that the Interland was a place that attracted people who were more adventurous, at least at some point. And so I'm looking at mobility as like a mindset, like is it a certain kind of person, right? And so it'll take some doing to code those things and is there enough information, because they weren't necessarily asking such questions, and I can only work with the information that are in the interviews. But do you have anything else?
Yeah, I would say for other social factors, you're right that what you saw on that list of metadata is basically what we have. I mean, there is other metadata in the VHA that we have access to that we could share, but it's a little bit raw, like lists of ghettos where people were in, historical information like that. One thing that I want to look into for sure is urban versus rural. I think that's a major, so Ariel Weinreich wrote about that Sabistika Lossen feature that I mentioned earlier, that it seems to have been on its way out in pre-Holocaust society. He basically says if you were to visit the major cities of Northeastern Yiddish, you would be hard-pressed to find younger people who were saying Sabbath. They're mostly saying Shabbos. So based on that, we can predict retrospectively that probably women were going to be doing this feature using it less than men. Kinds of the normal Lebovian principles of language change we would expect. Women would do it less than men. Women are innovative. Urban speakers would do it less than rural speakers. And also, we have data on this as well, but older speakers should be doing it more than younger speakers. Younger speakers, again, if there's language change, and younger speakers will be leading the change. So we don't have urban and rural coded in the data, but there are certain questions like this that we would just rely on the researcher to choose the interviews that you think will fill out these cells, and then you can do your own study based on that.
Yeah, and another nice thing is that most of the interviewers also press the speaker to talk about their parents and grandparents. And so oftentimes we have some information about where the parents were from. And so another factor might be parent language, right? That could also be some kind of a factor in how they speak.
So, or the language that they use in their schools, that's usually discussed.
Yeah, also, yep.
Or whether they went to a Yiddish school.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Super fascinating.
Ethan.
Could I ask the question? Everybody else as well? So you mentioned that both the native, non-religious Yiddish speakers in New York and the Hasidim diverge from the European dialect in certain ways, but the Hasidim diverge less. So I'm wondering if you have a theory as to why. I mean, I wondered if the majority of European Yiddish speakers you were looking at were more religious, and if you think it's partly a demographic thing, if like the Hasidim were closer to what the, culturally to what the dialect was there, or if you have theories as to why that is somewhat.
Yeah, so that's Isaac's paper. I'll let you.
Yeah. I would say for me, it's a kind of a straightforward story of language dominance. So the Yiddishists that I interviewed, they're all native Yiddish speakers. They spoke Yiddish with at least one of their parents. They're all quite fluent. We had a whole, hour, 2-hour interview in Yiddish, and they go to this Yiddish immersive summer camp-style retreat. But they're all dominant in English. So they speak English with many of their relatives even, certainly with most of their friends, and they go to English language schools, universities. They're pretty integrated into Anglophone New York society. The Hasidic community, there's a lot of English being used as well, but it's schooling is at least bilingual in English and Yiddish, if not essentially monolingual in Yiddish for the boys.
Yep.
And so that's my sense, basically. There's kind of a straightforward language dominance story, but both communities are shifting towards a pattern that's more English-like. The European speakers that I looked at were all from Israel, so they'd all moved to Israel, and I chose those speakers, so I didn't really, I didn't select them based on religiosity. A lot of them were basically, I think maybe nearly all of them were secular, but I chose people who had resettled in Israel because Hebrew is not a language that has that aspiration feature where they're saying table. Sorry, I assume I produced aspiration just then because that's how I talk, but table. Hebrew is not supposed to do that either, so they wouldn't have been influenced in their productions from English. So hopefully they're more baseline European-like.
But I presume there's all kinds of study of the impact of Hebrew on Yiddish speakers.
There isn't that much study of anything.
Some study, sorry. And I know there's not, in general, Yiddish culture in Israel is understudied, I know that.
In phonetics, there's almost nothing.
Yeah, in phonetics is almost nothing.
Yeah, you're looking at the two people. No. So there have been sporadic studies.
In the context of Hebrew, modern Hebrew, Israeli speaking is also reliant on Yiddish.
Yeah, the phonology of modern Hebrew.
So it's a very, it's a reciprocal relationship.
And I talk about this in this paper, but I didn't interview people in English. I felt a little bit uneasy about interviewing people in English, also would have doubled the work. But my suspicion is that Hasidic English, which has been written about by Isla Fader, it might also have less aspiration than we would expect for English variety. So their English might also be Yiddish influenced in a way that these New York Yiddishists, their English is, New York English.
So I was going to say that when you say there's a lot of English in the Hasidic community, it's a different English, and so at some point in the course of time, since the first settlers came to New York, the circle of exposures sort of closed out like outsiders, and people just started speaking to each other more and more. In the early years, for example, teachers in the school were sometimes non-Jewish, definitely non-Yiddish speakers, and so they were exposed to mainstream English. At this point, there are no outsiders, hardly ever, any, in the schools, and so they're speaking English to each other and reinforcing. And so my guess would be, although I did a little bit of a bilingual comparison using word lists, and there is an impact of English, and there is a convergence of the Yiddish over time to the English a little bit more, but it depends on what features, and I didn't look at the bursts, release bursts.
Yes.
I'm curious about Israel. Obviously, Hebrew must have influenced speakers of Yiddish in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that in the other direction, that there's extensive influence of Yiddish, especially on spoken Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
On the level of phonetics, on the level of intonation, and
Idioms.
of course, idiom.
Yeah.
Is anybody studying that?
That second question, yes. There are a number of people who have gone so far as to claim that Hebrew is an Indo-European language. It's been relexified from Yiddish, which was a Slavic language. Some interesting theories out there. I would say the influence of Hebrew on Yiddish, the only person I know who's working on this, it's in the contemporary realm, is Dalit Asulin, who works with Hasidic speakers in Israel, and the innovations that are taking place now in Yiddish, because these people also speak Hebrew. But yeah, I think these materials, I mean, we hear lots of Hebrew borrowings. I had a very interesting discussion with one of my reviewers who said it's kind of strange to see, because we have this convention of writing non-Yiddish words in all capital letters, when I go to respell them in the Yiddish alphabet, the Hebrew words don't get written in Hebrew letters, only the Yiddish ones do. So it's, you see like, mishtara, like police or something, like a modern borrowing that's in English letters, but everything else is in the Hebrew alphabet. But that's a convention that we have, just because it's a non-Yiddish word. Yeah. It's not an ideological stance.
I was wondering, you seem to have studied the hinterland and that area of Central and Southern Yiddish. Was there any reason you did not do any study of Lithuanian or Litvish Yiddish, of the Northeastern dialect? Or was it just what was available at hand, or?
So this came out, so this is the early days, right? It's the first data, it's like the data that's hot off the press. Like I was rushing the transcribers so I could run my vowel analysis. So the reason, what led me to specifically to this region is that in my dissertation I analyzed contemporary Hasidic speakers and then needed to compare it to something. So I looked at interland speakers, and then I heard, and then I looked at these vowel differences, and I said, aren't these supposed to be, like, isn't this supposed to be a length contrast? What's going on? And so I left it kind of hanging in my dissertation with some hypotheses. Well, I think it was changing, but I had no way to show till I didn't have data from those Polish speakers. And so I was really excited to get data from the Polish speakers so I could finally compare the interland speakers that I used in my dissertation to the Polish speakers, and that's where I'm at. But I think you're looking at Lithuanian.
Yeah, so the Sabistic Wilson study that I'm going to be doing hopefully soon, once I gather all the transcripts, will be exclusively Northeastern Yiddish, because that's where the feature is. There's another interesting, so we're discovering little subdialects. We're not discovering them, but they're emerging in the data. There's a speaker we already have on the website who's from Disna, which was a steto, how he would say. That was made, people know it from the Kulbach, from Kulbach. Anyway, he has an interesting feature which has been called Wamedwashen. I don't know where people, I've tried to find like who came up with this term, but basically a lot of his L sounds are W's. And this isn't a speaker where the ambient language is Polish. This is just the native dialect of that town, but he says, so he says steto instead of shtetl, and all sorts of interesting things. So we see these subdialects emerging. There's, infinite number of things.
And not just Polish?
What?
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I'm finding in the speakers from the Huch area, a few that are doing that that have the split of the dark light L, like the Polish, although in their Yiddish, and it's fascinating. It's just absolutely fascinating to listen to, because like how does that phonemic split happen in a language that didn't inherit it, right? Is it a phonetically conditioned thing? Yeah.
It just occurred to me that we have a screen I can just show you. I'll pull it up as other people ask questions.
You're saying there's implications for area linguistics.
Yeah, for
like
sure.
In this example.
Yeah.
So here's a speaker. His name is Jan Gavrupo, and this isn't the fact that he speaks this way was not at all important to the people who created the VHA. They wanted his life story, but it's interesting for us linguists. Let me see if I can find a word.
Yeah.
So Deutschland, I believe he always pronounces it with the W.
Our is going to be our.
Okay, it's not the most cheerful line, but we'll hear it.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Oh, he's reading actually at the beginning. Let me make sure my audio is turned on. There might be, I don't know, echo.
Mein jüngster Bruder ist auch umgekommen
Oh,
von der faschistischen Deutschland.
So Deutschland, he says.
Deutschland.
Yeah, it's an interesting feature.
So this is something you haven't seen before, Isaac?
I had heard the term Lamed Woshen before, where people pronounce the Lamed as a Wamed,
Right.
but I don't know where I encountered this. If anybody knows where this term was used, I would love to know. I assumed it was basically an influence from Polish, but it's pretty far. It's over here. So I don't know what's going on. But we have at least 2 speakers from Disna, so we can see how pervasive it was, maybe. Okay. Any other questions? Len, yeah.
Well, my father was from Minsk, Gubernia, sort of a Litvish Yiddish, distinguished between Shah and Sa, but his Shah was fronted.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like Chepe, Shabbos, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So is that on its way to becoming a mess?
Oh yeah, that's a question that I'd like to know more about. Yeah, we have studies. There are studies from before the war that were conducted where basically you have lists of speakers and the words where they have sa and sha, but we have acoustic analysis now, and we can actually measure the frequencies of these sounds and see how fronted they are. And so one question I want to find out, just purely phonetically, is this thing that's been called sibilant confusion. So sha is being confused with sa and the other way around, or za and ja. Are these actually being confused in the sense that there are still 2 categories, but they're just being used interchangeably? Or is it possible that there are 3 or more realizations that are distinct? So that's the kind of thing that we can analyze quantitatively to find out in these recordings. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, the Zoom room is empty, so if there are no other questions, we can adjourn. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.